Welcome to Stories from the Center of the Universe, the podcast about the human experience.
John, Chuck, and Jeremy, welcome to the Center of the Universe.
Glad to be here, Paul. Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, Paul.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I met John. It's been 8 months, maybe.
Yeah,
we met 8 months ago. Mutual friend, and you started telling me the story about Sergeant Davis, and then you somehow, in a pretty short period of time, put together a dream team. And I would argue who I'm talking to tonight is the core of the dream team. But there's a dream team put together. John, I can't imagine you saw 90% of this coming.
No, not at all. I mean, I've said this to Jeremy and Chuck before. To me, it was like the perfect storm. I mean, everything just came together. I mean, I couldn't have dreamed this trip of going any better for us as far as coming together and the trip itself than it has. I mean, just kind of everything worked out into place. I mean, I meet Chuck and we hit it off, and then I had dinner with General Petraeus, and he said, I got this colonel I want you to meet. And it turns out, I talked to Jeremy. Turns out he and Chuck already knew each other. I mean, it was absolutely unbelievable. So things just kind of came together, and for a good reason. I like to believe in fate that things are meant to happen. I really believe this trip was meant to happen, and what we're doing as far as helping veterans, that was meant to happen too.
Yeah, John, if you could help us out here, we spent, 80, 90 minutes talking about Sergeant Davis' story, but if you could give us like a 1 or 2 minute high level, I feel like it's not doing justice to his story, but at least it gives us a good
Sure. Rodney Davis was a Marine Medal of Honor recipient. He was killed September 6, 1967 during Operation Swift, which was one of the most violent battles of the Vietnam War. His company of 200 Marines, a Bravo company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, basically ran to a buzzsaw of an estimated NVA force of 2,500 men. It was hand-to-hand combat, got ugly, got dirty real quick, and an enemy grenade landed in their trench that Sergeant Davis was sharing with 5 fellow Marines. He jumped on it, used both hands, stuffed it underneath his body to absorb the entire blast, saving the lives of 5 Marines in that trench with him, which is an amazing story in itself. But then you add the fact that Sergeant Davis was African-American, and those 5 other Marines were white at a time where America was really wrestling with the issue of black and white. That summer of 1967, more than 150 American cities had race riots. But 10,000 miles away, the closest thing to hell on earth, those guys had it right. Didn't matter what your color was. Didn't matter what your daddy did and where you were from. They were brothers in arms. They were Marines. They were Americans fighting together and bleed the same color red. They were brothers in every way, sense and way and form.
I don't know where to go next here because I don't want John to spend the entire first 20 minutes being the only guy talking. I guess, Chuck, from your perspective, because John and Chuck, you guys met before John and Jeremy, or was it all roughly?
That's correct. That's correct.
So, Chuck, from your perspective, how did you and John connect?
Yeah, Paul, John and I actually met at a barbecue. Yeah. I wish there was a better story than that, but I should take a step back. We have a mutual friend who is a pretty high official within DOD, who's also just, and this is a common theme in this, right? Who is also just a great human being. And once a year, he brings people together at his house, and that's where I met John. We had worked with this gentleman in different capacities, and just started talking with John about some of the work I had done in Vietnam, and he started talking about the work he had done with the Davis family, and it was an instant connection. Just when you meet another person who's passionate about humanitarian cause, instant connection. Yeah,
really cool. And then Jeremy, how did you connect with John?
I suspect John is maybe better equipped to tell the story, but my understanding of it is John was at a social event. I think it was a dinner.
Correct.
With General Petraeus and Lieutenant General Barbero. Everyone was getting to know each other, just making small talk. And the story of John's work on behalf of Sergeant Davis came up. And I know General Petraeus pretty well from my time in the Army, the 101st. He and I actually commanded the same battalion, as well as General Barbero. So General Petraeus had the battalion, and then he handed it off to Lieutenant General Barbero. And then, of course, several years later, I came along and commanded the same unit. But while I was in command, it happened to be the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Hamburger Hill, which was another very violent battle in the Vietnam War. It occurred in May of '69. And so during my command, because it was the 50th anniversary, and I've always been very actively involved in veterans and helping veterans and recognizing veterans, I said, well, I'm going to I had jumped into D-Day, by the way, in 2014 for the 70th anniversary. And I saw the power of that to all the veterans that were there. And there were hundreds, if not thousands of veterans there. And so fast forward in 2019, I've got a special place in my heart for Vietnam veterans. And I said, well, I'm going to give these guys the same thing that those World War II guys got. They deserve it. And my division commander, who actually I can say his name now on this camera because I'm retired. He is now a 4-star. His name is, at the time, he was Major General Pappas, now General Pappas. He said, nope, disapproved. He said, Jeremy, I want you to focus on war fighting. He said, you're not here to do this veteran stuff. I came back to my unit after that encounter and I said, well, he's wrong. We're going to do it anyway. And, we started the coordination with Chuck, who was in the embassy, and it was the better part of 2 years. And instead of the Army paying for it, which is what I was asking the division commander for help with, we had to pay for it all out of our own pocket. So we did a lot of fundraising. But at the end of 2 years, I took my veterans from the Battle of Hamburger Hill back to Hamburger Hill in the A-Shaw Valley. And these are all old men at the time of our return, of course, most in their 70s, some in their 80s. And all but one had never made it to the top of the hill because the battalion took 70% casualties during the 11-day fight. So it was really a 50-year odyssey for these men to reach the apex of Hill 937 there in southern Vietnam. And we did it in 2019. And I thought that would be a one-time thing. I did it because it was the right thing to do for the veterans. And I love these guys. I think of them as my own soldiers. But man, was I wrong. That was definitely not a one-time thing. And so, of course, General Petraeus was well aware of it. General Barbero was well aware of it. And they were both, I believe, retired by that time or soon to be retired by that time. But the world kind of found out about it. Fox News sent a news crew along. They did a documentary. It's now streaming on their streaming platform. While we're standing on the top of the hill, one of my veterans, a gentleman named James Green from Columbia, South Carolina, as you might imagine, it was a very quiet time. I was just giving everybody a chance to sort of be there in their own space. And he leaned over to me and he said, hey, sir, I always wondered if guys got awards for this. I heard stories about guys getting awards, but I got medevaced halfway through, so I never got anything. He said, frankly, I was just happy to be alive. And by the way, the story of his medevac is incredible. I mean, it's like something you would see in a Stallone movie. But anyway, I there standing on the top of Hamburger Hill, I told James, I said, oh, wow, I didn't know that. You've now given that problem to me, and I'm going to fix that as well. And so it just kind of kept growing from there. We came back from Hamburger Hill. I gave up command and moved on to the Pentagon. And while I was in the Pentagon, I started researching the National Archives to try to find what awards James Green might have earned, if any. And it turned out he had earned a lot of awards. I think the number was somewhere around 14 or 15 awards that he didn't have on his chest. So I coordinated with the governor of South Carolina, a bunch of other politicians in South Carolina, even the sheriff's department in South Carolina, his friends and family. And we essentially converged on the State House in South Carolina about a year and a half later. Had country music stars from Nashville that came, Army band came. We made this big thing out of it. And I thought that would be the end of it there. We did the Hamburger Hill climb. I got James Green his awards. And then it has just kind of grown from there. We've now done multiple award ceremonies. General Petraeus introduced John and myself. And it's funny, I remember the first conversation, John, I said, look, if we're going to do this, we got to call in my buddy Chuck Casey. And John goes, oh, no, I already talked to him. I already know him. We met at a barbecue. I was like, well, there you go. And so it really, Paul, has just continued to grow quite rapidly from there. And what I like to say is as long as we have the capacity to do it, and there are Vietnam veterans out there who need it, and there are many, I'm not going to say no. And I know Chuck and John feel the same way. So I'm in the process now of completing the documents with a lawyer to make this an official 501c3. And we are calling it the Longest Climb Foundation. And of course, that's a reference to the 50-year climb it took for the Hamburger Hill vets to get to the top of Hill 937. So that's a little bit of a long story. You'll learn quickly. I'm long-winded, but that's really how it all came together.
Jeremy, there's a ton to unpack there.
Yes.
And I'm not going to ask this question in this podcast, but when I have you on individually, Jeremy, I do have to ask how General Pappas responded to you ignoring his strong advice.
Well, there's a reason I'm Colonel retired bowling now. Let me just say that. How about that?
That would have been predictable, I guess, right? I think
I'm half joking. I'm sure he was probably not that bothered by it because he was, deployed forward and fighting a war. And bluntly, my battalion was the number 1 ranked battalion in the warfighting metrics that we tracked in the division at the time. So I think we met his intent, which was focused on warfighting, which we did, and we still took the veterans back to Vietnam. So everybody got taken care of there.
Excellent.
Nice. Yeah. John, what was the impetus for taking the trip in the first place? Whose brainchild was it?
Well, actually, I have to give credit to Chuck. I think when we were at that barbecue, of course, probably had a few beers. And we're talking about the story of Rodney Davis. And Chuck's like, well, what do you think about, suggested the idea. Of course, I didn't know at that point they had gone back to Hamburger Hill in 2019. But he suggested, what do you think about the idea of going back to Vietnam to honor Sergeant Davis that way? And I guess I'd never thought about it because it's so far beyond the pale for me. I'd never thought about it. But that really, I was like, wow, that'd be pretty amazing. But I still thought it was pie in the sky kind of stuff. And it wasn't until I first met Jeremy and then, talking to General Petraeus that night, and I realized just there were a lot of people who would support it, be supportive of it. That's when it really started to dawn on me, hey, this might actually happen.
Chuck, how many trips have you taken to Vietnam based on veterans getting back to the place that they had experienced as young people?
So I'll answer it a little bit differently, Paul. I actually lived in Vietnam for 6 of the last 12 years across 3 different assignments. And so to answer your question directly, the trip that we did with the Davis family was, well, besides my own father, who was a combat veteran, that would have been the first time kind of formally in this capacity. But when I was in Vietnam, especially when I was assigned to the embassy, I was the Marine Corps attaché in Hanoi from 2017 to 2020. And it was a period for a few different reasons. It was a period of exponential increase in the relationship in every different way, economic, people-to-people ties, security. However, I also realized immediately when I was there that these war legacy issues in general are still very deep on both sides. There's still a lot of healing to be done. But also when I started being involved in some veterans exchanges on both sides, I just saw the power of it. And so, Paul, I don't even have a number. I lost count of the number of times I've been a part of veterans exchanges, veterans reunions, both American veterans coming back to Vietnam and their family, even Vietnamese veterans, helping them overcome the legacy of war challenges on their sides, linking veterans from both sides, linking children and now grandchildren, like John's son, with veterans on both sides. It's just been exponential, Paul. It just seems, like Jeremy said, just seems to be picking up more momentum as time goes by.
And it sounds like you've been involved in so many that it's almost like the 10-year-old version of you riding a bike. Like it's when you suggested it to John, you're like, yeah, this is something we do, and let's get it going.
Yeah, it really, it was funny because I could see John's reaction, but I wasn't even acknowledging that no might be an answer. It's just in my mind, it was a very logical thing that, telling the story is so important on the U.S. side, but if you truly care about the family, I'm the son of a combat veteran. I understand the pain that some of these families have carried with them for decades, not just the individual, but again, this second and third generation of war. And so I know full well that truly can't be reconciled until people have the opportunity to have this experience. So in my mind, Paul, it wasn't really an option. It was like, well, John, if you come this far, let's get it on the calendar. I don't think it even registered that no might be an option.
I mean, John wrote a book. I mean, what's a trip to Vietnam?
Yeah, but still, that's a whole nother step. I never saw that coming at all. Never in a million. I've told so many friends of mine from college, when I first started writing that book, never in a million years would I have envisioned us being not only in Vietnam, but at that very spot where Sergeant Davis was killed. I mean, never in my wildest dreams. I mean, it's still surreal. I'm still pinch myself every day just to make sure it's real and it actually happened.
So how long after you guys, Chuck, you suggested, hey, let's take a trip to Vietnam for the Davis family, How long did it take before there was serious planning in place? And Chuck, I know you and Jeremy to some degree, and you guys tell me, you guys were pretty involved in the planning, if not leading the planning. Tell me about the planning stage. We'll start with Jeremy.
Yeah. Sure. I think it was a pretty rapid turn after we all sort of met through various dinner parties and barbecues and whatnot. And we all said, oh, let's do this. And Paul, you know the deal. I mean, you've been wearing the uniform for many years. Planning to do hard things is what we do. I mean, that is literally what we do in the Army and the Marine Corps. So that part is second nature to us. And frankly, John is a natural leader, and you see it when he's around his family there in Vietnam, but just you pick up on it very quickly as you get to know John. So for the three of us to sort of throw our lot in together and start putting a plan in place for this was, I mean, none of us ever batted an eye and said, hey, is this a good idea? Should we or should we? We just went straight into execution mode. So it came together nicely. And the reality is John has a really great network of people that know his work, or frankly, in many ways, his life's work, and they were happy to support that. Chuck literally feels like he knows everybody in Vietnam. I mean, you go in small mom and pop shops, and there's a picture of Chuck on the wall sometimes. He took me to like the Vietnam version of Trump Tower. Literally, we're with walls lined in gold, and there's a picture of Chuck shaking hands with the owner of the Vietnamese version of Trump Tower. So, you know, it just made perfect sense to us, and we just started putting the things in place. And lo and behold, before you knew it, we had people that were willing to help finance the majority of the expenses to help us get there. And the family members had said, yes, we want to be a part of this. We have historians that support us from the Center for Military History. They also do that on their own time in the evenings and weekends to support our sort of nonprofit effort. So it's just a confluence of events and a confluence of people who care about doing the right thing on behalf of veterans and veterans' families, and everyone stepped up to the plate and did their part.
Chuck, what was the long pole in the tent from your perspective?
I think it was actually just getting the Davis family to hear the idea, to be receptive to the idea, and then trust us enough, Jeremy and I, you know, and John, to go along with it. You know, that takes a little bit of time because, again, like John said, you've never thought of it, right? I don't think the family ever had an intention of returning back. And so when you even start proposing that, you open a Pandora's box of emotion that's been, you know, in a different place, a deep place for a long time. And John, you opened a lot of that when you open up the book, but still, you know, to for someone like Nikki to think that she's going to go back to the soil that her father stood on during the most horrible human being could ever experience. There's a lot there, Paul. And so, you know, the emotional process for the Davis family to go through again, you know, from first hearing the idea and getting over the, hey, John, you're crazy, to, hey, maybe I'm interested, to now I'm really thinking about it. And then that deep emotional part to say, you know what, I'm really going to commit to this. That took a long time. After that, Paul, unfortunately, most of what Jeremy's saying isn't untrue. Yeah, just after spending all that time in Vietnam, I'm just very comfortable operating there. And it's a great place to be, Paul. It's very welcoming. A lot of people don't realize this, but 90-something% of Vietnamese have favorable views of Americans and have for years. It's a wonderful place to be and very welcoming. So I didn't really worry about any of that, Paul. Just I knew that I was optimistic that the Davis family would get to a yes. Because again, just in my own family's journey and other veterans I've worked with, they deep down inside, a lot of them really know that they want and need that. And I also knew that once we had that yes, logistics stress would fall into place. I also knew that John could talk about how I have nothing but affinity for Vietnam, but like our own system where there's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of bureaucracy in the Vietnamese system. And so I also knew that things like visas and confirmations of meetings would go till probably the last day. I think some of our delegation literally got their visa the morning that they were taken off for the airport. That's par for the course with me. But I don't know, Paul. I mean, you over the years, you develop good relationships with your counterparts in another country. or another place, and you build good relationships, and you know what they have to do, but you also know at the last minute they won't let it fail. And I'll say this, Paul, anything associated with legacy of war cooperation or humanitarian cooperation in Vietnam is a no-fail mission. They just don't let it fail. It's so important to them. It's so important to who they are as human beings. So yeah, that's kind of what planning looked like.
To me, I think the hardest sell for me was talking with Nikki Davis. I remember the first time I called her. She's a banker in the Bay Area in San Francisco. I remember the first time I sent the email out to the whole family, but then I followed up with a phone call to her because I wanted to talk to her, hear her voice. And I told her why we were doing it, and explained to her what the trip would probably entail and see how she felt about it. And she was dumbfounded at first. I mean, wasn't really quite sure what to say. And I let her go. And she called me back about 3 weeks later. And she was game. She wanted to do it. I mean, it turns out she needed that closure. She needed that peace. And, since we got back, maybe about a month that we got back, she called me and told me that all of us in our group will forever hold a special place in our heart because all those emotions she had buried so deep inside for so long, now she can always think of her dad with love and with peace because of that trip. And heck, I almost started crying. I'm about to cry now just thinking about it. But I mean, you didn't know what kind of closure and the peace that you needed until she did it. And she's been, her younger sister wasn't able to make it, but I know they've talked extensively about the trip and about what it meant. And I wouldn't be surprised if the younger sister Samantha eventually goes back to Vietnam herself.
How big was the delegation, and how many family members of that number?
We had 14 people in our delegation, and there were 4 Davis family members that were there.
Okay.
Including, like I said, Nikki Davis is the oldest of Sergeant Davis' two daughters. She was 2 years old when he was killed September 6, 1967.
Yeah, so she doesn't have any real memory of her father.
No.
Other than what she's been told and what she's seen in photographs. And I'm sure a lot was filled in for her on the trip, I imagine. Hey, Jeremy, I don't know who took the video that John sent me.
It was Josh's video he's talking about, guys.
Okay. I will tell you that I'm not a guy that cries a lot. Like I imagine a lot of men who have some pride don't cry a ton. My 18-year-old daughter, seen me cry once, but John sent me that video and I was bawling like a little baby. And I don't know anybody in the Davis family besides John's connection to the family. And I'm like, wow, this is powerful stuff. I can only imagine being super close to it, like his daughter or John or even you guys, because you put real time and energy and commitment behind this. So Jeremy, the day you got to the site, you're prominent in that video. What was that experience like for you?
It's funny you say that. I don't stress about things. And I'm sure part of my Army background, I was an infantry officer, an airborne ranger kind of guy. And so, you go through those trials and tribulations as a young officer, and it builds in you a leadership ability to sort of stay calm in any scenario and just not stress and lead. But I will be honest, I was pretty stressed leading up to that moment. And the reason for that is I understood, and it's because the experience we had in 2019 with the Hamburger Hill veterans, I understood the weight of the moment that carried for the Davis family. And we had this incredible team that got us to that moment. And frankly, none of which would have been possible without John and his research and the book. But I knew once we got on the ground there that the weight transferred to me. Like that's the role that I was recruited to play in this mission. And so that's a heavy burden. And I said there in my remarks, I don't know if you saw the video where I mentioned it up front, but I usually can put together a speech pretty quickly. And oftentimes I don't have to write it out. But for whatever reason, I was really concerned about the proper words to say for this one. And the reason is this was different. Sergeant Davis wasn't with us, right? This was his daughter. And the story of her father, I can only imagine, has shaped her entire life. That's what she knows of her history and relationship with her father. And it's my job to do justice to that at what would arguably be the most emotional moment of her life as it relates to that story. So just an incredible weight. And so two things happened. In May of this year, I actually was listening to the Sean Ryan podcast. He does a great show. He also brings in a lot of veterans. He is a veteran himself. And he gave remarks that day that were intended for a Memorial Day audience. But I never forgot it. For whatever reason, his words really stuck with me. And I thought I was going to try to shape his sentiment that he shared that day. And I decided I'm actually just going to quote him. And I did. And I gave him credit for those remarks up front. But I would say that I quoted him, not verbatim, but probably, 75% accuracy, because it was such a powerful thing that he said, that the sentiment that he expressed, and I'm sure you heard it in the video, Paul, is, am I an American worth dying for today? And I thought that really captured it. And, having watched the video that Josh Rowe put together for this event and speaking with John and Chuck and the family members, I feel like we did justice there. So it went exactly as it should have gone. But I will also say, even though Josh Rowe had put the small mic on me as we were actually on the bus, I forgot that it was on me the entire walk as soon as we got off the bus, because I'm just focused on doing my job, right? My job is to paint the picture for the Davis family and the entire entourage of how this battle unfolded and why we were there and what led us to the trench. I completely forgot that little microphone was on me. And I've had a lot of people come back and say one of their favorite parts of the video are the words that I shared with Nikki, just trying to get her to be comfortable walking down into the crater. So I'm glad that microphone was there so that they could capture those words, because I think it shows the reverence of the moment that we as a group, adhered to pay proper respects to Sergeant Davis and his family and the entire event.
Not that you or anybody else would have been any other way, but that moment captured on the video screams pure authenticity, right? Because it perfectly was.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
No overly produced anything about it. It was just pure raw authenticity. Although
I still joke with Regina about not wanting to go down to the thing.
There. Remember, we had the big giant Marine with us, the funny guy. I had him as my reserve plan. If anyone said no, they weren't going down into the trench.
Let's back up. How long was the trip for Nikki? I mean,
she came from San Francisco.
Everybody, say again.
She came from San Francisco.
So it was about a day to get over there for her. That's fair?
I think for everybody it was about 18 hours. Does that sound about right, Chuck? 17, 18 hours?
36 hours for me coming from Huntsville, Alabama.
It's a solid 30, John.
Maybe it was longer. I blurred it out, maybe. That's all.
36 hours.
John popped an Ambien and woke up there. It's a high quality. It's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, because you've flown a bunch overseas, you're pretty exhausted the first day or so, at least the first day.
You're wiped. I just got back from a trip to Vietnam, and I leave again next Wednesday. It's exhausting, Paul.
I think you could run for election and maybe get the top spot in the Vietnam government, maybe.
Actually, I think you're right.
Last year.
I'm sure they would vote for him.
Well, Paul, on that note, I would also say, like, the first day we got there late Sunday night. And I've sent you some of the pictures. You've seen the resort we were staying at. It was really incredibly nice. And we just gave everybody the day off Monday. After a long day of travel, just relax by the pool, walk in the ocean, just relax, get yourself together. Because we knew it was so grueling on everybody, physically and mentally, the travel.
Yeah.
All right. So after the day of rest, how long was the trip? How long were you on the ground?
I think the better part of a week, maybe a day shy of a week on the ground. Yeah.
So besides the moment at the location where he gave his life, what were the highlights of the trip prior to that, or maybe just after that?
John, you want to?
Well, for me, it was, I love we had a welcome dinner the very Tuesday night we got there, and there was a senior official from Hanoi had come down, and the U.S. ambassador was there with us, as well as with the current Marine attaché had come down from Hanoi as well. That was great. But also, to me, the biggest thing on Thursday, and you guys can vouch for this as well, we met with former North Vietnamese soldiers, Vietnamese government officials, and Vietnamese Gold Star families. We talked about unexploded ordnance in the country, missing service members from both sides, and children afflicted by Agent Orange still to this day. It was an incredibly powerful back and forth. We met this one woman, for example. She's a Vietnamese veteran. She had the Vietnamese equivalent, I guess, to the Medal of Honor. Is that what I forget what it's called?
Yeah.
And she's telling us that she'd come down from the north as a 14-year-old saboteur to fight for her country. And she had lost basically everything, like, her brothers, couple brothers, mom and dad, her whole village or whatever. But she was incredibly sweet and just wanted to hug everybody and take pictures. And all I could think of was, like, if I lost that much, could I be that powerful, that strong, that positive? And so I had tremendous respect for the resiliency of the Vietnamese people, just interacting with them. And we had a great time. Jeremy spoke, Chuck spoke. And at one point, like, my son is sitting beside me, and Chuck can verify this. He leans over to me toward the end of the meeting and goes, "When do I get to speak?"
Yeah.
I just look at Chuck like, "Oh my God, I've created a monster."
Yeah. But if I could chime in on that part, because I actually think it's really important, and I know Chuck will back this up. I did not know going into our trip in 2019 how much healing would occur in these sorts of events, because all of my personal energy had been spent on putting together this plan and getting this group of people moved from one side of the planet to the other. I mean, all the things that you do as a battalion commander when you're, moving your unit from one continent to another. I never stopped to think about the emotional piece of it until I got there on the ground and I started witnessing what occurred. And what I had asked Chuck, at the time, Major Casey, to do for us, I said, I want you to find some surviving North Vietnamese Army veterans who we believe fought against my guys on Hamburger Hill in 1969. And of course, Chuck did that. He had no problem doing that. And I will be honest, I had some reservations, like, is this really a good idea? But I was like, we're doing this, man. Like, we're going all in on this thing. And not only was it a good idea, I will even go so far as to say, aside from our ascent of the top of Hamburger Hill, the interaction with the North Vietnamese veterans was the best part of the entire experience. That's incredible. And that was hugely educational for me. And probably the two things that stand out the most, and I'll get to why this is relevant for our recent trip as well. At the base of Hamburger Hill, we discovered that the Vietnamese had erected a very small but formal museum to the battle, right? They don't call it the Battle of Hamburger Hill. Actually, it's Dong Ap Bia, Hill 937. But they had erected a museum for that same battle, and we didn't know. And so when we get there and we get off and we kind of get our bearings of what's going on, and we start to go in this building, like, oh, this is a museum. And one of the soldiers who Chuck had found, which was also a female North Vietnamese veteran, is in some of the pictures in the museum in uniform from the battle. And you walk around to the other wall in the small museum, and there were pictures of my soldiers on the wall from the battle. So think about that. Think about how unlikely it is that two young people who are fighting for their country in 1969, completely unbeknownst to themselves, would come back together 50 years later in the same place and have their photos in the museum. So, of course, we had them get together and be in a photo of today. But what happened there was that, like, immediately broke down all barriers that exist. I mean, they were gone after that. And then the veterans started interacting. Of course, we had several interpreters that were helping, and Chuck was a big help with that. But by the end of that week in 2019, and we did sort of our last event was, I refer to it as a state dinner, where it was the Vietnamese delegation and the U.S. delegation. We came together, and it was really a great event. But Chuck had actually recommended, and I guess I can say this since we're both retired, that I sneak in a couple of bottles of Jack Daniels because apparently that's harder to come by there. So I did that with the intent of bringing it to that final dinner. And we start passing them around the table. And of course, everybody's drinking the Jack Daniels and having a good time. And by the end of that last night, the veterans who 50 years earlier had literally been trying to shoot and kill each other, they're lifting up each other's shirts, showing the bullet wounds that they sustained from Hamburger Hill, pointing at each other saying, I shot you first. No, you shot me because I was here and you were there, and laughing about the whole thing. I mean, it was, I really wish that I would have filmed all of that. I think even my words right now are not doing it justice. So that was incredibly powerful. So fast forward to this year when we started to plan this event, and I said, Chuck, we got to do something similar because this is just as big an event of the Vietnam War. And I know that, this needs to be a part of it. And Chuck, again, because he knows everybody, was like, yeah, I can make that happen. And he goes and gets essentially a Medal of Honor recipient from the Vietnamese side and probably 25 other Vietnamese veterans or North Vietnamese Army veterans. And we all got together in a room and had an equally incredible experience. We're back and forth. And there were some emotions coming out on both sides. And that's okay, because guess what? There's a lot of emotions tied up in these events that occurred 50 years ago in Vietnam. But by the end, we were all laughing and joking and going out to dinner again that night, passing around bottles of whatever that was and doing Vietnamese chants as everyone took shots together, right? And by the end of the night, everybody was best friends. So the power of bringing these two groups together is just something to behold. And I think for me, that is in large part a reason why we understand there's still a need to do more of this, because there are so many more people on both sides of this that stand to benefit hugely from this experience. And I'll stop with this piece here. It's really powerful for our veterans to go and see these surviving North Vietnamese veterans, because what they're able to humanize it, right? They're able to say, oh, well, I was an 18-year-old American that was drafted and went and did my part. And now you look across the aisle and you're both 70, 80 years old and you realize that was also a teenage veteran that their nation asked them to step up and fulfill their duty. And that's all they were doing. And they've lived their life ever since with the same level of emotion and trauma and pain and trying to rebuild their lives and their families and their nation. And here we are all together today doing the same thing. It's incredibly powerful.
Yep.
I can't think of anything more powerful. Yeah. And so the work needs to continue. It sounds like, and you guys sound like you're very game for that. Chuck, I have to ask you a couple things. One, do you speak Vietnamese?
I do.
And what was being passed around at that state dinner for your most recent trip? You have any idea?
Paul, sometimes it's better not to ask.
Chuck, the ultimate diplomat. I love it.
Well, maybe there are a couple of ingredients that the general consumer doesn't need to know about.
Sometimes it's better not to ask.
So have families been reaching out to you guys in various forms and ways?
I've talked to several members of the Davis family since we got back, and they all just called to just say thank you. And, just the trip was beyond anything they even anticipated as well. Again, I'm sure they all went in there with, not concerned, but just, unknown. This is the unknown. And the trip was just gave them more closure. And for me, on Josh's video, I saw Deborah Ray, who was Sergeant Davis's sister, say that it brought her closure. I called her as soon as I saw that and told her how much I loved her, and that how it made me feel so good to hear her say that. She wasn't there, but it brought her some peace as well. And same with Nikki Davis and Regina and Davis, my own son as well. And it's been amazing. And the whole family, I know they got together when they got back, and all 4 of Davis family members had the whole family meet in Macon, and they told them about everything we did on the trip. And so for me, I just feel like you did something really good, and you brought some peace and healing and closure to a lot of people who are desperately in need of it.
Is the word out that you guys do this?
Yes, that's where we need your help, Paul. That's why we all jumped on this podcast. with 2 hours notice. I think what all of us agreed to after this one, Paul, is especially the opportunity this year going into the 50th anniversary of the formal end of the war, right? And just what better opportunity to really get the word out. And again, especially as veterans are aging, but also as their sons and daughters and grandkids are coming of an age where they're increasingly curious and interested in coming back. We would like to aggressively get the word out that if you've ever thought about coming back, do it. If we can help, we'd love to.
Yeah.
And
Agreed.
Yeah, I'll do whatever part I can. I will tell you the first time I talked to a veteran about his story where I felt like I was doing something really cool for the family. He was a 98-year-old World War II veteran. This goes back to 2019, maybe early 2020. He was a 98-year-old, as you can imagine. He wasn't a spry 28-year-old. But you could generally piece together the story he was telling. And he was at the Battle of Bulge. He won a Bronze Star with V device. He had a story to tell. And his daughter was desperately trying to get the VFW or Big Army or someone to tell his story in whatever form that was. And she couldn't get anybody to participate. And look, the Army's big. VFW's big. They can't tell everybody's story all the time. My mom happened to know this daughter, and she said, my son podcast, whatever that is. And so I was able to record his story. And I'm like, there's probably a massive opportunity for a lot of people to be telling these stories in ways that lead to healing, lead to these trips, lead to whatever good comes out of it. So I'm all in, whatever you guys want or need me to do.
That'd be great. I just want to add also, Paul, we had another young man, Major Steve Rakeem Tarunk. He's the only active duty service member with us on the trip. His grandfather was Sergeant Davis's platoon commander, was standing right next to Sergeant Davis to his immediate left when that grenade landed at their feet. He had curled up into a ball thinking he was going to die and would have had Davis not acted at that critical moment. So for me, it was Steve had talked about this battle with his grandfather since he was a young child. And he'd always grown up emulating his grandfather, and that battle is what defined his grandfather. So I was there in November 2014 when Steve graduated from OCS, and it wasn't a dry eye in the room. He got his gold bars, and the first thing he did is go to the National Museum of the Marine Corps, did a ceremonial first salute to the picture of Rodney Davis. And
Wow.
so it's not just for the Davis family, but for his family as well. His grandfather passed away in 2010. It brought a little peace and closure for them as well, for Steve to be there, the very spot where really defined his grandfather. So it was really powerful for him as well.
Yeah, your trips have tentacles that you guys will never understand fully, but I'm glad you understand many of the close-in tentacles. Chuck, this is a weird question. It sounds like you suffer from permanent jet lag. What is it about Vietnam that keeps you going back? Obviously, your dad's a veteran. That's part of the story. He served there. But what else is it about the country that keeps you going back?
It's the people, Paul. It's 100% the people. There's I'll never fully be able to understand how a country can go through so much, how people can go through so much. Not just our war, Paul. I mean, Vietnam has fought for its survival and its independence and its existence for all of the last 1,000 years it's existed. 14 wars with China, over the last century, wars with all the major powers. And and their messaging is consistent, through the centuries. If you read, truly all they want is to live in peace and for their kids to grow up in prosperity, literally the same things that we want. And if any country on earth would have the right to be bitter or angry or hostile to foreigners and especially to us, it would be Vietnam. And they're not, Paul. I will never fully be able to understand how they're so able to. They don't forget the past, right? They study it, they learn from it, they teach about it so they don't repeat it. But then they immediately shift to working together, build a better future for the next generation. And you can't help but want to be a part of that, Paul. I'm now that I've retired from government, I work in the private sector. And what we're doing now is just linking, companies big and small, American companies big and small with Southeast Asia, especially Vietnam. And it's a lot of work. Our systems are so different and requires such patience and just people to connect it. But you can't help but do it, Paul. There's such good people at the core. And Jeremy hit on something that reminded me before, but when I first started going to these, or being a part of these veterans exchanges, when I got to the embassy in 2017, again, it was just one of those really busy periods, both because of the opportunity and because of geopolitics. It was one of those years where you're getting 400 emails a day, quite literally. And so when I started receiving emails from Jeremy's team and Kyle, Jeremy, the lieutenant on your team, who was very, very sharp, it was hard to prioritize. I felt bad that I couldn't devote more bandwidth because I knew it was important. It was a human thing, Paul. But you've got different bosses, the Pentagon, these things you're trying to pull for American strategic interests. But when I started being a part of these human exchanges, it just became immediately important to me that this is what matters, right? In any relationship, it's the people-to-people ties that really matter. And what I saw from the Vietnamese side, where I was going with this, is every time my Vietnamese actually isn't that good, Paul. I can get along, okay. But what I found every time was the Vietnamese gentlemen, every time the Vietnamese veterans would be desperately trying to message to me that please make sure your American friends know that I'm not a monster. Please make sure they know that time I spent on the battlefield, like Jeremy said, that when my country asked me to do what I did as a young man, I did it. Please let your American friends know that the rest of my life I spent being a teacher or a doctor or a community leader or a father or a grandfather. This is me. And it's the people, Paul. I mean, just at the end of the day, what we realized, and my father said this all along, my father was, did 2 tours as a combat door gunner and saw, again, some of the worst that humanity has to offer. But what he said all along was our people always had more in common than we ever had different. Just the values we subscribe to, how we raise kids, what we want the world to look like for our kids. They've always been the same, Paul. And so back to the constant jet lag, it's brutal. I look like a zombie right now. But you can't help but want to keep rooting for it, Paul. You can't help but want to bring our countries together, find opportunities for both, find healing for both sides.
Yeah, I mean, that jet lag is worth it, right? Because you're doing extremely powerful work for countless people, right? And so, yeah, you'll take the jet lag if that's
take the jet lag. I'll take the jet lag, Paul. You're literally transforming lives, and you can't put a figure on that. Yeah. It's an honor. It's an honor to do it.
All right, Jeremy, I think you're probably the most appropriate person to answer this question. And John, please do not take offense that I didn't choose you.
I don't.
You can certainly share your answer to this as well. Jeremy, what's the biggest lesson to be learned from the Sergeant Davis story and maybe and the trip you guys took?
Yeah, actually, I think John is the most appropriate person to answer the question on the Sergeant Davis story, but I will gladly give you my take. To me, the fact that you can take young men from any background, race, color, creed, religion, none of that matters. Whether you could do it in 1967, you could do it in 2003, and you can do it today in 2024. That's the thing that sets, in my opinion, the United States military apart from so many others, right? And it truly is. And what I mean by that, and Paul, because you've worn the uniform, when you get down in the trenches, I mean literally in the trenches, in the mud, with the soldiers and the Marines, and for the sailors and airmen and others who have their version of the trenches, when you get down in there, nobody cares what you look like. Nobody cares what God you pray to. They don't care who you share your bedroom with. They don't. You don't have the luxury, frankly, of caring there. But because our Army and our Marine Corps are trained by non-commissioned officers like Sergeant Davis, who are professionals, they can field a force of young Americans that can go out into awful places, awful situations, just like that valley in Vietnam in 1967, and do incredible things. And they don't think twice about it. I promise you, and I don't know Sergeant Davis, and obviously I wasn't there, but I promise you, he didn't think twice when he took those actions in September of 67. He didn't. I know he didn't. You don't have that luxury. But he did that because that's who Sergeant Davis was, and that's who these young American service members are, and that's what makes us different. And so the big takeaway for me from this event is just more evidence of that being the case. And I think John will do more justice to it than I, because he's really spent his life studying it. But the last piece I'll say is this: you transpose that lesson on top of the bigger picture here, which is bringing these veterans, bringing these family members to these locations in Vietnam where they can get the healing that most of the time they don't understand they need. It is truly the most powerful thing you'll ever witness, in my opinion, as a human being. And I that's not hyperbole. So I'm going to stop there and hand it off to John, because I know he's great words.
Jeremy, I love your answer. John, you obviously wrote a book. Sergeant Davis was part of your family. I was hoping Jeremy would round out from a military perspective, which is why I chose him. He did a wonderful job of that. But you're right.
He always does.
You've dedicated a lot of your life to telling the story, and I think it's culminated in this amazing trip. So obviously your answer is powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo everything Jeremy said. I would also just say this. These Marines were 200 Marines facing an enemy force of 2,500 men, 10,000 miles away from home, outmanned, outgunned. But they worked together as brothers in arms, as Americans first and foremost. And it goes to show when we get over the issue of race, what we all are capable of as Americans when we work together as brothers. That's what I take from that story. We're capable. The sky's the limit. There's nothing we can't do, but we got to get over the being idiots sometimes.
Well, John, you and I told this part of the story, and you alluded to it at the beginning of this episode. But Sergeant Davis grew up in Jim Crow, Macon, Georgia, right? He wasn't afforded the same things that his white peers, and I use the term very loosely when I say peers, but white men his age or white teenagers his age, and then to not think about saving the lives of his Marine brothers. I mean, not a millisecond, no hesitation. And the fact that the 5 men that had their lives saved that day happened to be white men. And the fact that your research is what teased that out. It's unbelievable.
You know, the funny part is after I found out that all 5 of those guys are white, I went back to the guys I had interviewed. I was like, my God, why did you guys tell me that all those guys were white? And, Rodney was black. And they never even thought about it. Rodney was just one of us. He was just another Marine. He was another Marine. We never thought of him as a black Marine or as a white Marine. We were just Marines. They never even thought of it as the issue of race. But that was the beauty of the whole story. Again, 10,000 miles. America's going crazy with the issue of race, but 10,000 miles away, the closest thing to hell on earth, those guys had it right. It's a crazy story.
Yep.
All right, let me pivot to the 501c3. You guys are trying to do this more often through a nonprofit, be a little more organized. Not to imply that your planning was not organized, it clearly was, but to make it a little more formal with a 501c3. You want to tell us more about what the nonprofit is trying to accomplish? And I don't know which way to pivot, Chuck or Jeremy.
Yeah, I'll take the lead on that, but I'm sure Chuck and John will both want to add to my piece here. But really, it's organic, and what I mean by that is the whole formation of this thing occurred from the bottom up. As I said, I mean, we never intended in 2017 when I reached out to the U.S. Embassy in Vietnam to start a conversation with Major Chuck Casey. I never thought, well, I sure hope this turns into a nonprofit, 8 years later, right? But and like I said, also in 2019, stand on top of the hill. I thought that would be the end of it. And it wasn't. And then the next time it wasn't, because after that ceremony in South Carolina, another veteran came along and we did the thing for him in Texas. And then after that, another veteran came along and another one and another one. And then I meet John, and then we bring Chuck back in and we're going back to Vietnam. And so it has all just been a bottom up sort of grassroots organization that is formed out of necessity. And I think the 3 of us feel a great honor that we're in a position to put this together in a more formal organization. And I will tell you, I've already been contacted by multiple people that want to donate. I mean, they want to donate to some group of men like us who are giving back the way that we are. And I've also now been contacted by multiple other Vietnam veterans who are saying, hey, I would love to be a candidate to also have an experience like this. And I've also had multiple Vietnam veterans reach out to volunteer. I've had one guy come up on the net and say, hey, I'm a professional travel planner. The next time you guys need travel plans, count me in. One of my veterans from Hamburger Hill, but is still in incredible shape, and he's 80 years old. He said, if you go back and you need another person to go along, he goes, count me in. So, we're just the ones who are fortunate enough to be in a position to bring it all together so that we can continue to give this to the people that need it the most. Chuck, John, what do you guys think?
Chuck?
Like usual, Jeremy, I couldn't say it any better. I mean, seriously, it's Paul. This is absolutely humanitarian spirit. What John didn't mention is when we all started. Again, it was never a question if we were going to do it, Paul. When we all just decided that we were going back to Vietnam with the Davis family, we didn't even talk about the money part, Paul. It was just, I think all of us just knew that we would just pay our own way to go there was the right thing to do. And then what we also realized is there's so much of a need for this. I mean, there's so many families, Paul, that need healing. And, the reality is some people were able to take their Vietnam era wartime experience and be able to take those skills and be successful in business and do other things. But a lot of them were not. A lot of people who in families who could use this experience don't have the resources to get over. And I would say that this experience definitely taught me that to do this right and to do it safely and to do it effectively does take resources. And so I think Jeremy is absolutely right. Just this was a natural evolution done of nothing but the pure humanitarian spirit, but a way to structure this more so that we can do this right. So we can offer this to more families and hopefully even do it at scale. So.
Yep.
Two great answers, John. You want to hear your perspective?
Yeah, I would just say, I think this is amazing. Chuck and Jeremy, those guys, I'd follow them anywhere, right? But for me, it was always about, again, you do something like this, like Chuck said, on scale. For me, it was a few years ago after my book came out. I remember one day I got a phone call. It was a Michigan phone number. I was about to leave work at George Mason. And normally I don't answer the phone, for a number I don't know. And it turns out to be Ron Posey's niece. He was a platoon sergeant for Sergeant Davis. He had come to Macon a few years earlier, and I met him. And first time we met in 2009, we spoke like 4 hours. He cried the entire 4 hours, and I cried about half of it. He got back to Denmark a few days later, sent me an email thanking me for getting that off his chest. He'd been married for more than 40 years, had 2 adult kids. He had never spoken a single word to anybody about anything that happened in Vietnam, let alone what happened on that awful day of September 6th. And he's thanking me for allowing him to get that off his chest and help him sleep better. I just cried like a baby. A few years later, he passed away. Before he passed away, my book came out, and he asked me to send a copy to his brother in Michigan. Ron was originally from Michigan. And I didn't know why. He asked me 3 times. I was happy to do it, so I did. And turns out he and his brother were really close before he went to Vietnam. And Ron had changed when he got back, and they became distant. And his brother didn't know why. And so the niece had called me to just tell me. She found my phone number, got it from somewhere, and called me and said she came back to her father's house, found her father reading my book and crying in his study because he realized why his brother had changed.
Yeah.
I cried like a baby again. And then a few years later, in 2019, Ron passed away from pancreatic cancer. And the whole family was back in Denmark with him when he passed. And they had a service for him. And the whole family called me. And they thanked me for allowing their family to be close and get to know him in his last 3 years. What do you say to a phone call like that? It's never been about money. It's about, like Jeremy and Chuck said, it's about healing and helping people. And that's what it's all about for me. And that's what drives me every day. So if we can do it through this nonprofit, that helps us do it on scale, I'm all in.
Yeah, great answers from all 3 of you. John, I think what's in order is every time they take a trip to honor a group of veterans or a specific veteran, you need to write a book. This has been great, guys. I appreciate you doing this on short notice. In my own very small, humble way, I'll do what I can to help you guys. And it was fantastic meeting both you, Jeremy and Chuck. You guys are salt of the earth kind of folks that love your fellow man for sure.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd also really appreciate if you'd rate and review us. You can find us at scodupodcast.com.